But now it's getting so, there's so few of us, and you think, where did it all go to?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our prayer home. We will have our prayer service now.
Kind of gets me worried a little bit. Like in 50 years or so, will we still be doing this? Like, will there still be people enough there to run a prayer service?
Who is going to be left to be able to even sing in 5-part harmony? How do you teach that? How do you learn that? And that is a huge, huge part of the Doukhobor soul.
The priests, the Orthodox Russian Church, the priests of that church, condemned them by saying, you people are wrestling against the Spirit of God. Well, the Doukhobors replied to them, no, you are wrong. We wrestle with the Spirit of God.
We are Doukhobors. The name was given to us in a derogatory term, but we took it on because it was the spirit wrestler. So you're wrestling with the spirit of life, of God, in yourself.
The very first sort of precept or teaching or understanding is that is the belief that God resides or is reflected in the soul of every human being. And that concept at the time in the 18th century, when our forefathers and forebears first conceived it, was revolutionary, because Russian society was so hierarchical and built upon the structure of the Orthodox Church, where the priest served as this powerful role as a teacher and sort of a monopolizer of ideas and the conduit to God, and to be able to sort of come to the conclusion that you didn't need that middleman, so to speak, to have a direct relationship with God, because he in fact resides in all of us, was nothing short of revolutionary.
I don't need a priest to pray to God. I don't need someone else to tell me how to believe. It's within my heart. And you just think about how progressive our ancestors were to believe that, to throw away all the strappings of the church and all the, and to say, no, I'm gonna believe in my heart. It's huge.
If God resides in all of us, then the next logical conclusion that flowed out of that was that, well, then everyone is equal. Which was mind-blowing for, again, you had this very stratified society, and suddenly you have these people, coming from the lower depths of it saying, no, we're all equal.
The Spirit of God is within, and that's why we need to respect our brothers and sisters. I guess somewhat based on the 10 Commandments, love your God, love your neighbor, do not kill or hurt your neighbor, because the God is within. So that means God is love, and love needs to be ever present, and love is peace.
The Doukhobor faith is not so much a pure religion. It doesn't follow the dogma of many other religious organizations. People are spiritual, institutions are religious. So the whole simplicity of the Doukhobor prayer service, of the Doukhobor organization, is just that we don't have to connect with a priest or a pastor in order to feel that we belong spiritually. We go out and we become part of the community, and one of the founding principles of the Doukhobor movement is that each individual person carries that spark of divinity within, and that's where the spirit of God, or that higher power, is in each individual person. And the Doukhobor movement exemplifies that in celebrating that each one of us is a spark of divinity.
Yet another belief that flows from the inward dwelling of God is that, well, if God resides, within us, then why do I need to attend this church that was built by the hands of men? There's nothing blessed or holy about it. It's wood, it's sticks. They took to heart the Bible passage that says, a church is wherever two people meet to praise God in His name. And they took that quite seriously.
Well, I'd say it's a lifestyle, part of your lifestyle. Because you could communicate with God whenever you need to. You could sing in God's presence. So I would say it's a lifestyle. It's not just on Sundays. It should be every day in your life.
It's like a way of life, eh? We didn't have no preachers or anything, but we had some advisors. And they were the older people that would tell us, like, we don't do that, or whatever it would come up.
I think a person who believes in peace and love is really the key thing. That's the most important thing, in my opinion. And, being generous and loving to your fellow man, right from here in the prayer home to people you meet on the street, and being an active contributor, standing up for peace and kindness and not going to war.
What I like to tell people is, from what I take from it, is to be a kind person, to have balance in your life, have positive energy out for everyone, love thy neighbor, right? Treat everyone fairly, and that's what I live by.
Well, I think you just have to be true to yourself and true to others, and try to be the best person you can be. Being a Doukhobor is basically believing in God and believing in yourself, and always being kind and not fighting.
If God resides in each of us, then to harm another human being is truly an affront to God Himself, and is harming God Himself, and hence the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." And from that, the choice and stance not to serve in the military and not to perform any acts of violence.
Of course, one of our beliefs is, that everyone's life is important, that there is no such thing as sacrificing a few for the greater good, because, everyone has a life that should be precious.
What is essential is the idea of non-killing. And a lot of people of us have forgotten about it, because that's why the origin of the Doukhobors, in a sense. They were dissidents from the usual frame that war will continue. And the churches often, send their men to war and they praise them. Doukhobors don't. And to me, that is one of the strengths of the Doukhobors. And that is why they got rid of dependence on the church, the Bible, the icons, and all of that. They could have direct access to an individual because the Spirit of God, love, beauty is in the person. And this is what the essence is. And it cuts across boundaries. It means a Hindu or anybody else could be a Doukhobor, in a sense. To me, that's what's important.
I don't think that you absolutely have to need to have a Doukhobor background. Maybe people like to join the Doukhobor community because they enjoy it, because it's something they find that pleases them, and they kind of admire what they do, so they want to be a part of it.
A lot of people have asked me, are you a Doukhobor? Because having a Doukhobor father, does that make you a Doukhobor automatically, or is there some initiation process? Do you have to believe certain things? If you eat meat, are you a Doukhobor? If you don't go to millennia, are you a Doukhobor? It actually was through the course of my academic research that I did a lot of reading about ethnicity. What is ethnicity? What does that mean? And a lot of reading about Doukhobors and who they are and what does that mean. And I came to the conclusion that yes, I am a Doukhobor. I'm ethnically half because I have one parent that is a Doukhobor, but I am a whole Doukhobor because I have a Doukhobor spirit. I believe things in a Doukhobor way.
The Doukhobors' belief in pacifism really came to the forefront in 1895. That Easter, the young Doukhobor men who were serving in the army made the decision to put down their weapons and refuse to go on parade. Matvei Lebedev was one of the first of them to do so. It was a heroic act of self-sacrifice on the part of these young men, given the repercussions they faced for defying the authorities, including in many cases torture or exile to Siberia and likely death. You know, the decision by the Doukhobors to protest militarization, protest their participation in the army within Russia, ended up becoming this major flashpoint. A couple months later, on the evening of June 29th, 1895, thousands of Doukhobors gathered in 3 sites near their villages to pile together all of their guns and set them on fire. This event became known as the Burning of the Arms, and it was a real watershed moment for the Doukhobors. This was their stand against militarism and declaration of pacifism to the world. And while it crystallized their beliefs and faith, it also brought severe suffering on the community, who were suddenly in the crosshairs of the Russian authorities like never before, for having the audacity to make a stand like this.
Our Doukhobors burned the firearms, right? Or anything that was involved for killing something or a person or a human being. That was done for a reason. The Doukhobors took the 6th commandment out of the Bible and said, "Thou shalt not kill." So that's the commonality amongst the Doukhobors.
Personally, what the suffering of my ancestors means to me is that it's given me a life of peace and freedom. They struggled. They also dealt with their struggles by nonviolence. And they were serious about it. They didn't just talk about it, they actually did it. If they were getting whipped, you know, in some type of raid of government soldiers on their villages, they would stand there, they wouldn't fight back. You know, this reminds me of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King. That activity of nonviolence.
They talked about how each family had to give up a child or a person to go to this war, and usually they resented that, and they were taken to Siberia, some of them. My great-grandfather from the Verstegen side went way to Siberia.
They went through very harsh times. They were moved from place to place and persecuted for their beliefs, and many of them were imprisoned and strapped. Actually, I had one great grandfather who did have a back full of scars from being whipped.
And I saw my great-grandfather's back. He had 40 lashes, and all that's left of his back is scars of ribbons all across it.
He came over from Russia. That stuck in my mind as to what our forefathers suffered.
Well, my grandfather, again, was the youngest of that group, and he talked about it a lot at the prayer services. And he talked about a different aspect of it. And of course, he'd cry, every time he talked, because it was just, they were treated so severely. And he was so thankful to be in Canada to pass on the concept of peace to us.
It's very touching to me because my ancestors were very strong and they stood up for themselves. And they wouldn't go to war because they didn't believe in fighting. I think that was just tragic and horrible that they had to go through that just for their beliefs.
So how did they survive? They had to have that inner peace, that connection to God. Like same when they were being whipped and then when they were being taken away. You can take from me whatever you want, but you cannot take my soul. You cannot take my being. You cannot take my strength and my faith and my essence.
The suffering that these people endured and were prepared to die for their beliefs. Literally, it's amazing.
Conditions were getting bad enough for the Doukhobors with the persecution that they were under that they had to leave Russia. Their survival depended on it. After much searching, they found a new home that was willing to let them resettle, Canada. The Canadian government was eager to bring settlers at that time into Western Canada and made an agreement to provide land for approximately 7,500 Doukhobors to settle in what is now known as Saskatchewan. Doukhobors were refugees, and we didn't really use the term refugees, 120 years ago, but they were. And, these days when we talk about the crisis in Syria and a lot of the struggles around the world, we talk about refugees as being a major issue in terms of people being displaced by conflict and because of persecution. Doukhobors were, amongst a group of refugees, and at that time, the largest single group of refugees that Canada would have ever accepted in. And so it's interesting to me in the current context, I never thought about that before, right? I never thought about myself as being descendant from refugees, but absolutely I am. And that's what they were. And they were refugees fleeing religious persecution.
When you read the earliest newspaper accounts, for example, in Canada of the Doukhobors' arrival in 1899, what stands out is this tremendous outpouring of goodwill and support, material support, in terms of really helping this group of people that, thanks to the English and American Quakers and Leo Tolstoy, their plight was quite well publicized, and it was fairly understood among the average Canadian that these were a persecuted and oppressed people who had come seeking liberty, specifically religious liberty, to Canada. And, the public perceptions have changed and shifted over the years for a number of reasons, but that really, to me, showed, Canada at its best in terms of really welcoming the Doukhobors with open arms.
We are a group of people who went against the church and the state because they controlled them in their daily lives and in their livelihoods. And they stood up for the values of God. Killing brothers is wrong. Not supporting people to have a better life is wrong. And so people sacrificed their lives to create that environment for those types of values to flourish, and coming to Canada was the right place for that to happen.
A huge leap of faith. At that point in time, boarding a cattle boat to an unknown land on the other side of the world must have been like going on a rocket to Mars. I mean, the journey was uncertain. Nobody knew much about the destination, and yet within months or a few short years, they basically replicated Doukhoboria, land of the Doukhobors, as they knew it and lived it in the Caucasus. They transferred that in large part to Canada, and at least for a few years, it was Little Russia on the prairies in their blocks of land.
The women had to bear a lot of the burden because the men went away to work on the railroad to make money because they didn't have money to buy things. And so they didn't have money to buy the animals, to run the equipment, and to get all the supplies they needed and so on. So she talked a lot about that. When the men went away, the women carried the load. And so when you see the women pulling the plow, it was voluntary pulling the plow because they didn't have cattle and the men were away. And so to get the crops in, that's how it was done. So she talked a lot about that and the support they got from the Aboriginal community, that when they saw how the Doukhobors were suffering, they came and they helped. They offered some food and things like that. So that kind of adjustment.
English-speaking white farmers were the preferred immigrants at that time, but not enough of that sort of immigrant was available to fill the space. So at the turn of the century, Canada began to consider opening the gates of immigration a little bit wider, and Eastern Europeans, such as Ukrainians and later the Doukhobors, were thought to fit the bill. Not a perfect fit, mind you, but good enough in the meantime that because they were farmers, because they were white, and because they were Christian, they would at least reflect those aspects of Canadian identity ideals. The fact that they spoke different languages or had slightly different religious or cultural traditions was something that it was thought could be eliminated in time once the population settled and assimilated. So having survived corporal and in some cases capital punishment of members of their community for their religious beliefs in Russia, nobody should have been surprised that when they came to Canada that they would be quite prepared to hang on to their identity.
Let us close our ranks in friendship, love, and freedom's banner, while our old refrain we're singing in familiar manner. Long live, spirit of love,
I walked into his office one day, and he said to me, "Dad, I got a big contract today." Oh, I said, how much? Oh, it was several thousands of dollars. But he said to me, "Dad, I'm not going to produce their products because it has to do with the military. And what I produce will help somebody kill somebody else." So that is the depth of his understanding about thou shalt not kill. I think it's quite rare, but so commendable.
We still try to uphold the principle of thou shalt not kill. And, it's getting to be different in the society now than it used to be 40, 50 years ago. Because 40, 50 years ago, if you were against fighting or going to war, that was a real sin, or whatever you want to call it.
My father was one of the 7 young men who stood up and didn't go to war. He actually went to jail. He refused to do anything that would help the government war effort. So he went to jail. When some of the other people built the road up to Montreal Lake, he refused to do anything. So he's on the scroll downstairs with the conscientious objectors.
Yeah, there were quite a few conscientious objectors who didn't go to war, and they either, if they were on a farm, they paid a fee to the government. Others went to jail in Prince Albert, and others still did some road work. It's interesting, we're talking about Bill Pirahudov, the artist. He was one of those conscientious objectors, and he was in jail. Most people don't know, but he was, because of conscience, he was against war. Peter Makarov was one of my idols. I mean, he was a real Doukhobor, but also a Tolstoyan pacifist. I remember attending one of the meetings, I think it was at but a church or Unitarians, and there he was, and he said, you know, my pacifism began at my mother's breast. I thought it was tremendous. He started right off the bat, and he continued throughout his life. And in the 1960s, the early 1960s, he and I had the pleasure of organizing several peace manifestations around Verrigan and Yorkton, and also at Suffield, Alberta, at the chemical plant there. And we were there to urge the Canadian government, but also the people of the world, to stop wars and to use nonviolence as the way to negotiate a peaceful world.
And I knew both of my great uncles, and both of them were pacifists and refused to serve in World War II. They had to go work up at L'Orange and help build the road there. That was, you know, part of their punishment for not serving. Just the strength to take a stand for something that you believe in. And even thinking about our ancestors burning their arms when they know they would probably die, but having the strength of belief to do that, to try and create a more peaceful world. We need some of that. We need some of that today. We need to continue to teach others to have that strength so that we can have a better world for our children and our grandchildren.
St. Peter's Day, which is that celebration of the burning of the arms, is kind of like the big event in the Doukhobor calendar. The Doukhobors in Saskatchewan continue to celebrate this day every year on June 29th, and it is a time for the community to come together and to celebrate the sacrifices of our ancestors who made their stand for peace and for Doukhobor beliefs and went through incredible suffering to be able to allow the Doukhobor community to come to Canada and for a new generation to be able to thrive.
The Peter's Day in Blaine Lake was conducted in a wooded area on a field, and it was done under a tent. And they could seat roughly 400 or 500 people underneath that tent. And that was packed all the time for the whole day. Like they'd start in the morning and they would continue till just before supper. They'd start, they'd have a millennia, maybe a few choirs sang, then they'd stop and they'd have their, well, almost like a picnic dinner, and then they'd go back again, and they would continue.
And then, of course, the other thing that was interesting was St. Peter's Day in the big tent. And you know, all the cars that were parked there and the picnics that were outside and a lot of watermelon and a lot of singing. I mean, that was just something that we grew up with, right?
So when I was a kid, it was like a big deal. The tents went up, everybody filled their car full of picnic lunch, and the kids ran around, and while the adults sat in the tents and got hot and sang and talked. And they talked and they talked and they talked.
Peter's Day days were very long, not as long as according to my dad, when he was younger, he said they were 3-day affairs. Ours was a day. Lots of the elders would get up and share their stories about memories that they had of their family members who were in Russia and who experienced the burning of the arms and the trials and tribulations that they had making that decision. Lots of song. That's what resonates with me and still does today, is the beautiful singing, the choirs. The family getting together, all of the family would, even those who had moved away would come home for Peter's Day. It was a very, very important part of my life and still is today.
I do remember when I was younger going to Blaine Lake and having like full day Peter's Day services. They were like so fun, really, because there was a lot of young people there and you had a lot to visit, but it was also a really busy day to take away from the rest of your week. And so I know that used to be days long. Then it was a day long when we were younger. Now it's, an hour or two, which in our busy world is nice that people, the prayer home still fills up on those days here. So that's nice to see for sure.
Well, it used to be called Dom, which is a home, and it used to be a community center where people did gather for different reasons. Even now we have a boar supper, we have variety night, it's a community center. And now when you look around us, the word community center is very common, very popular. So it's a gathering place. When you say prayer home, that just implies that you only use it for prayers. Well, you can use it for prayers, but you can use it as a gathering place for, like in the past they used to collect in a dome.
Well, the home could not accommodate all the people that were there. We used to come here in the evening. They would have a program here, and this place would just be packed. There would be people outside listening and everything. I remember coming to the prayer home here. We used to have Sunday school. We were taught singing and everything else, and we participated in the services.
But it's still, you go there, with me anyway, the feeling is that this is where Dad and Nat worship God, and was leader of the community, and I don't know, it just has some
deep
feelings about it. Yeah.
Like the singing is amazing. Like you feel at home when you're there, and there's just like that deep sense of just like acceptance in your heart and in your soul that you feel.
I feel for me to belong since 1981, that's when I joined. It's a place where I feel comfortable. And when there's tragedy in your life, you have people totally behind you. It's comforting, and you know you do.
Coming to the prayer home, I know whether I'm walking into the prayer home in Saskatoon or I'm walking into the prayer home in Blaine Lake. I'm home. When I walk through those doors, I'm home. Singing plays a very large part of being involved with your Doukhobor community. And very much so because the Doukhobors that came from Russia, they were illiterate peasants. And so all these songs that they brought with them, they weren't written down. This was like an oral tradition that was passed on. And even some of the prayers, the same way. So usually the way that you started to understand what everything meant and how it all tied together was through singing.
My dad would always say singing is good for the soul, and it is. You can feel such peace, you feel such happiness being part of that choir and singing those songs that I grew up with. And maybe that's part of it is ever since I can remember, I remember Dad singing these beautiful Doukhobor songs. It's been part of my existence, part of who I am. And so when I sing it, it brings me peace as well, when I sing those songs.
But the sound is so ingrained in a person. It's such beautiful sound that Doukhobor singing that it stays with you.
I think we know there's meaning behind it, right? Historically, there's some meaning behind it. It makes me feel connected with my grandma and my great-grandma and, their relatives and all the seniors that we've met along the way. I think it keeps us grounded for some, whatever reason it is. I'm not sure. There's an energy to those songs that really, really keeps us, you know, feeling like we're there for a reason.
Certain songs need to be sung slow because in that slowness, there's that feeling of suffering, right? That certain songs are supposed to remind us of the suffering of the Doukhobors, or their previous ancestors, and how much they really did suffer, and they certainly did for their beliefs. That brought us here to Canada so we could live this life with, you know, peace and freedom here.
When you're singing and you have all these voices around you, and I have found if I close my eyes, it just resonates through your whole body. You can just feel the vibration of all these 5 parts. And it's a really, really lovely experience. Like it can actually bring you to tears. It really can.
My soul is flying. My soul is lifted. I just at peace. You just let yourself go and you sing with others around you. You're part of a collective. You're not yourself anymore. You're part of something bigger. And just closing your eyes and listening to those voices, it's incredible.
I think it's, when I say my prayers, I close my eyes. I think what I'm doing with have my eyes closed is I'm listening and I'm feeling it. And that's why I close my eyes. Not all the time, once in a while. But to me, that's where I feel peace within here. Is when I shut my eyes and I just listen to it. You know what I mean? It's just that kind of tranquil moment. You know what I mean?
Singing has been the cornerstone of every Doukhobor function. The singing is unique. It's an a cappella style. It has been something that I've been amazed by ever since my youngest memories, because I can remember my great-grandparents being part of the choirs. There's no musical instruments, there's no background sound at all, but there's hundreds of voices that blend together, and the sound is so unique, and to be there and to experience it firsthand in person, it's something you can't, I've never seen it replicated or duplicated anywhere. And some of the most profound, call them spiritual feelings that I've ever felt. You know, sometimes you get so excited and you get moved by something. And some of the bigger Doukhobor functions, like when you get to some of those big halls and you get thousands of people singing together in that same style, it is physically moving, it's emotionally moving, it's spiritually moving. And that is something that you can't describe to somebody. And I'm not a big religious person, but I have had several very spiritual experiences simply listening to 1,000 people blend their voices together and simply sing.
The Doukhobor's choral tradition is very important to Doukhobor religious belief and cultural practice. The Doukhobor style of singing is quite distinctive. Over the course of time, the Doukhobors developed a very distinctive way of harmonizing with one another. The way that Doukhobors tend to sing, there's a real pattern of breath that we need, and there's something really meditative about that. So you're physically coming to a peaceful state in just breathing and producing that sound. When a bunch of Doukhobors are singing together, I kind of like to think about how Doukhobors use the space that they're in as the musical instrument. We're almost playing that building as our instrument, as our sound is filling that space. It's like our sound is resonating off of the wood and bouncing back. It's really an incredible thing. So that what gets produced is more than the sum of its parts.
But I think that singing, which is a big part of the Doukhobor soul, has been how they've reached out to others. It's you know, I think it's part of how Doukhobors communicate. I mean, it's how they communicate to each other, and being at a Doukhobor prayer service, you know, they don't have the liturgy, they don't have kind of the message from the pulpit. It's that speaking to the Spirit of God within each other. So it's powerful amongst themselves, but it's also been part of how they communicate with the wider community. You know, I think when Doukhobors came to Canada, and particularly as they started becoming more integrated into Canadian society, it was Doukhobor choirs that essentially were our ambassadors out to the broader Canadian society.
I learned to sing in Doukhobor style because my mother and father always sang in their home, always. Or when the neighbors would come to visit, they would greet themselves and then they would gather around the kitchen table and they would sing all night.
So I was singing from probably about 7 years old. And it just came naturally to me. You know, nobody really taught me. I never went to school for that. I think it's just being part of Sunday school, listening to the choirs, and being everywhere where there were Doukhobors and singing with them. And, you know, later on in years, I really felt that I developed a voice.
For me, it just feels good, that's all. It does. It's just a good feeling. And you know what? It's not something everybody can do, and it's unique.
It's something that I truly love. I don't have to fake a smile or fake going to the choir or lie about not going to a practice, because I truly want to be there and I really want to sing and just participate in what they're doing.
After a while, you start to get really comfortable with these voices that you hear, and your voice just starts to go where it should automatically. Actually, it's like an apprenticeship. It comes with years of learning how to listen, because that's what you're doing all the time. Whenever you're singing with a Doukhobor group, and you're singing the 5-part harmony, which is the way we sing without instruments accompanying us, whether it's piano or whatever, you are always listening to see where your voice has to go. And as you get older and you get more comfortable with what you're, you know, where your voice and where your range is, you fall into it very easily. But it's like an apprenticeship.
And in my mind, it's just like on a blackboard, you had the 5 lines for the music, the chalk, and everybody has their own linea, their own voice. And I could see it in my head, and I know where to go just automatically.
Well, see, that's another thing. See, technically, I can't tell you how, but I have to hear you, I have to look at you, and I have to hear you, and whatever line you're singing, the harmony line, I can do the harmony then. But I need to hear that core soprano, I guess. But really, you know, there's a tenor and, well, they call it polovier, you know, and then there's the melody line, and then there's your alto, and there's your bass. So, and I tend to sing the high part usually, but I have to hear everybody around me.
I think one of the things about singing in the Doukhobor style in a choir that, for me, was the fact that you relied on each other to make the sounds come together, the words come together, and you had the different voices within the choirs. So you're not supposed to hear the individual voices, but when you're singing, you can pick out certain voices and say, whether they're just, you have to speed up or slow down or whatever the case may be. And just hearing the voices without musical instruments to interfere, I find is I don't know, there's no word that I can think of for it, because it's more than uplifting, it's more than, it's very, very unique. It's extremely unique.
Even people who are singing in the same register, the same part, are not singing the same thing, because like Polly Tokarev talks about having some variation, like if you go up, I go down. Even if you're singing in the same register, you're always trying to find a distinctive place, which is so fascinating when you think about the Doukhobor, the Doukhobor belief in community, in the idea of working together and taking care of one another and providing for one another. There's something so interesting about singing together, but still being distinctive within that. And I think that really provides us with a useful metaphor for understanding how the Doukhobor communities, despite taking distinctive strategies, have managed to survive into the 21st century, but have managed to integrate with other Canadians in so many respects while still singing their own notes.
I go to Millennia because first of all, it's certainly when we sing is when I feel it the most, is this sense of sharing each other's energy, of bonding, of becoming closer to other people. Not necessarily just because they think like you, they have the same philosophy, but there is a certain energy in that dynamic that we share. And also to reinforce some of the basic tenets of Doukhoborism, also to remind me of the history, the trials and tribulations of the Doukhobors before they came to Canada and even in Canada.
The Saskatchewan practice, we just walk in the door, we take our seats. At the time to start, the elder will kind of gather us together and start us off by inviting prayers, usually three from the men and three from the women.
During a prayer service, you have the men stand on one side and you have the women stand on the other side with the bread, salt, and water in between, and you sing to each other.
Well, those are the essence of life, basically. You need water and you need food to live, and you need the salt. And it's a combination, again, it's a trinity of essentials of life. And every single Doukhobor prayer place would have, any Doukhobor function would definitely have the salt, the water, and the bread.
It was a bit more important when we were younger that the men stood over here and the women stood over here, and I don't like to sit in the front, so I just go to the back row. Whereas now there's more intermingling between genders, between both sides, and maybe not so much from the choir at the front, but within the group.
Usually you sit according to where you like, which part you like to sing. So we open with prayers. You know, we welcome everybody and say Slava Hospodu and all the usual greetings. And then the men say their prayers. We try to get at least 3 prayers from the men, and then at least 3 prayers from the women. Anybody's welcome to say a prayer.
And then we start with 3 songs, and then the Lord's Prayer is said in Russian, said in English, and then sung in Russian. And then there's 3 songs again, usually, sometimes 4 or 5, hard to keep track, depending on the mood of the congregation as well. Sometimes the elder will say, is there anything else people would like to sing today? Or somebody will volunteer and say, yeah, I'd really like to do this song because something happened, this is relevant or whatever. And then afterwards, the elder gives a bit of a message.
But those 3 songs in the beginning, that again is the Trinity on top and on the bottom. But those first 3 songs should be very spiritual, meaningful hymns. The bottom ones can have a little bit more of liveliness to them.
So that's another trinity, you know, the prayer, the greeting before the prayer, and the bowing after. And after the Lord's Prayer, you always have to have that addition. We bow in reverence to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that's definitely the Trinity.
What does the bow from one Doukhobor to another mean? That in itself is rooted in one of the the oldest Doukhobor beliefs. That bow, which was traditionally 3 bows, very deep bows to the ground, were meant to really pay respect and homage to the Spirit of God in that fellow individual.
We bow after prayers and we bow after hymns. And we bow not because we are bowing to an audience as a performer would do on a stage after they performed. We are bowing to God and we are bowing to each other because God lives in every person. So when we bow in reverence rather than in a thank you, that you liked my performance.
Well, it is quite different because when I was younger, we just attended basically, and the millennia was done by the older people, by our grandparents and the great-grandparents and their parents, and yeah, they lined up on both sides of the table with the bread and salt and water on it. They sang psalms or psalms, and some of those psalms I did not learn, I couldn't understand until I learned to sing some of them later on, and the people sang them in such a way that the Russian military authorities could not understand them.
Next portion of the service is the singing of psalms. This perhaps illustrates the type of singing, traditional singing of the Doukhobors, wherein the words of prayers were extended and the words blended into each other, and we had the production of a special type of singing. Perhaps in history this was done to confuse the listeners who were not knowledgeable about the Doukhobors and about what was being said, and this has been transmitted through the years, and perhaps with the senior choir we have the best source of the present method of this type of singing.
I guess basically when the psalms stopped, or most of the psalms stopped, when the great-grandparents and grandparents started passing on. And then the younger people said, well, hold on, we got to shorten this. Because, the prayer services took quite some time. It was nothing out of hand to go an hour, hour and a half standing on their feet while they were singing these. And us little gaffers would sit on the benches and listen to this.
We generally have a discussion between ourselves what we're going to sing for the hymns and what we're going to sing for songs, and that is about it. There are people that are capable of singing real good, and they have a very good selection of songs that they can sing. So that's how it is done, in cooperation with everyone.
Right, to be respected as an elder, it's not just about your age. It's about earning that trust and respect based on your judgment and who you are as a person. And that's been pretty core to Doukhobor history and culture for a long time.
To be an elder, you have to be nominated, or you could volunteer at the annual general meeting that comes in December. It's basically the elders are the knowledge base for if anybody wants to have any questions, and an elder then can do the prayer service or do weddings or funerals, and I've conducted many funerals and many weddings. As far as I remember, it was always a gentleman who was leading the service. But then I asked a lot of questions too. Maybe I was the beginning. I'd say, well, when you say bratia y siostry, brothers and sisters, we always said, like even the 10 Commandments, love your brothers and sisters, So I perhaps was instrumental in having more roles for women.
Most of the societies in Saskatchewan are declining even quicker than Saskatoon. I'm sure you've heard from people who've told you, like, just in the past little year or two, there's been 3 societies in eastern Saskatchewan who have either closed or sold their prayer homes. So things are really declining.
I think we have to learn, at least we have to consider what it means to be a Doukhobor without that infrastructure and without that prayer home, because the reality is they are very quickly disappearing from the landscape. They certainly are in many areas of rural settlement in Saskatchewan. Does that mean the movement itself is extinct and gone? Of course it doesn't. But it does mean a different way of looking at it. Most of us have grown up with a prayer home in our backyard, which we took for granted. That prayer home had a vital, active choir, which we took for granted. It was full of members, which we took for granted, and those factors simply aren't necessarily the case today.
Братья все ликуйте, славный день настал, сестры торжествуйте, Бог нам радость дал, никогда чужие мы теперь.
My first language was Russian. When I first went to school, into grade 1, I could not speak one word of English, none. So it was very difficult for me in grade 1. And if you can imagine how anyone could fail grade 1, but I have the distinct accomplishment that I failed grade 1. Because I had to learn the language.
Well, when my brothers went to school, it was very difficult for them because they could not speak English. So they had a lot of hardships, because at that time, even the rule was you got the strap if you were caught talking another language. So they just made sure that I knew how to speak English as well.
My father, who was born in 1952, spoke only Russian for the first 6 years of his life, and it was only when he was immersed in the public school system that the process of English language assimilation happened, and that bowls me over when I think about that, because that's just within one generation. It's quite recent. This is the 1960s in Saskatchewan, and his experience was common to most young Doukhobors in the 50s and 60s growing up.
But when I was growing up, everything was in Russian, and of course I've never been proficient in Russian. I knew enough Russian to converse with my grandparents when it had to do with, daily activities around the house or around the farm and that kind of thing. But when it came to the language used in prayers and hymns, the language used in the many speeches that were given at the programs after services, I missed a lot of it because that wasn't my vocabulary, basically.
I remember very Russian services from, the late 80s, early 90s, where it was very elderly people, very much speaking in Russian most of the time, and having George Stushnoff and people like that really advocating for the young people to include that English portion of it, so that there was some more balance for everyone to feel included.
It's nice to hear of the sufferings of our ancestors, but it's much greater to hear the voices of the youth to ensure us that there is a hope for the future, that they will be here 100 years from now.
So going back to like when I started taking note, and we were youth, we were teenagers, we were in high school. We'd come to the service, and the services are all in Russian. And you sit there and you hear the hum of the song. You don't really get anything out of it because you don't understand the language. And so there was a big division, there was a big debate that happened at that time, back in the early 90s. Do they keep the hardcore Russian tradition, because that's what the Doukhobor movement came out of, or do we expand it and we translate it into English so that the youth can understand what this is part of? And will they retain it more, or will they relate to it better if it's in English?
A lot of times when Jeanette does the service or someone, they'll say, this is what this song is about that you're going to sing. And I think it would be ideal to have the phonetics and then what you're singing about. I know when I go and I'm sitting there with my granddaughter, like she's trying to sing and she loves to sing, but we have to sort of explain to her because Russian singing a cappella can be very, very moving, but I think it would be more moving for people who are there that they know what we're singing about.
So big deal, I'm singing in Russian and people don't know, my generation doesn't know what we're singing. I used to translate the hymns, so I wanted people to understand what the hymns were about, the message. And yet, I know of people that when they plainly translated the hymn note in English, and I was so glad because it's such so meaningful, so good words, and others would say, my dad would roll over in his grave if he heard that. It lost it. I don't feel that way at all. Give it to them for the best that they could get out of it, or they wouldn't get it at all. If you think only the Russian people, you're only going to enjoy it in Russian, that's not right. It's my philosophy.
Let us honor peace and freedom's triumph over strifes and war's immortal sin. We'll forget our sorrows and misfortunes, and to love our thankful.
I think each language carries in a certain emotion. And I think Russian, for the Doukhobors, carries a lot of emotion, a lot of things that can't really be said in English. And I think that could be part of the philosophy, you know, as it is with many cultures and many languages. Some things can't be conveyed very well in another language. So I think it's important to have both, certainly, you know, because many people certainly don't speak Russian or understand Russian now. But I think it's still important, and especially in the Psalms, the old Psalms, because there's a certain energy in the way the Psalm is constructed, with the words that are constructed, right, which gives a certain energy, and a certain emotion comes out of that. I don't think you can sing those songs in English. At least I've heard them sung in English. There isn't that same emotion. You don't have the connection with those people who sang it in the original Russian and why they sang those things.
Because there's something about the poetry of it that blends with the music, you know. Whereas you try to translate, it's awfully hard to translate. I mean, you're forcing it, and it doesn't sound good. Whereas the other one flows.
Russian is a very poetic language, and our traditions are very poetic. You lose a lot of that lyricism, that rolling, that poetry when you translate into English. Surprisingly, I find it harder to sing Doukhobor style in English than it is in Russian. Even, you know, in English, if I'm singing in English, I understand every word. If I'm singing in Russian, I don't understand every word. But somehow the songs are built in a way, the lyrics are built in a way that they're easier to sing in Russian. So I understand why there's such a hesitancy to let that go.
I think more English could be introduced because of less and less people are able to understand Russian. And so to continue worshiping God, is whether it's Russian or English, I think is really little significance.
if we have services now in English, I think it reaches more people. And though I love singing in Russian because that's what I was used to growing up, it doesn't bother me that English is used because I think now we're reaching more people. And I don't feel that there's a need to hang on to something just because it was tradition. I do feel tradition is important in a lot of ways, but you also want people to get the message.
Doukhobor belief is very much about direct access and communion with God, that we don't need any intermediary between ourselves and God. So with that being the foundational belief, to me it follows that there shouldn't be any language barrier in the way either. There's nothing essentially sacred about Russian. I think you can still be a Doukhobor if you're speaking Cree or Japanese or English or Russian. There's nothing essential about the language. The problem is that the specific practices that we have been developed in Russian.
And there was a debate. It was contested on both sides. But one of the projects that came out of that was for us to take the Russian hymn books that were completely Russian language and translate them using a phonetic English word. It was still the Russian word, but we were using English letters to try and pronounce these Russian words. Okay, so at least the youth could follow along and sing the Russian song, but read along and actually pronounce it using English letters we were familiar with. So we started that project to translate various hymns so that we could give it to the youth, and young people that had no background in Russian language whatsoever could at least follow along. So that was the first step.
And it's wonderful that they've taken and they have phonetically, because again, here, not everybody reads Russian. People have spent hours and hundreds of hours taking and phonetically working on every song so that those that speak English and phonetically can read what this says. So they're singing the Russian word, but reading it phonetically in English. Some people take issue with that. I personally feel, and this is just my personal feeling, better that you have the phonetic ability to sing that song in Russian by following it phonetically in English, than not singing the song at all because you don't know how to read Russian.
What that led to was then taking the actual Russian song and making an attempt to translate it into English so that we could understand what was the spirit of the song, what was it trying to say. Was it a reflection of some Doukhobor history, a triumphant moment, or a time of sorrow, or a struggle? What was the story behind the song? And as we were able to translate more, it did open up a window into understanding a little bit more of what the Doukhobors went through, what they were happy about, what they were sad about, what they were, spirit wrestling, what was the cause, what were they fighting for, and what was it that they came to Canada to try and preserve for us to enjoy, that we didn't have to go through persecutions and struggles and stradania, as they called it in Russian. So that window into that translation was hugely beneficial for us young people.
Russian is important for the elders because they were brought up with that. That was their first language. To them, a lot of their identity is being Russian. It's not as important to my generation because I don't speak the language. Is it beautiful to listen to? Some of the psalms, can you necessarily translate some of the songs in English and have them sound the same way? No. Do I love singing in Russian? I do. I don't understand what I'm singing, but I can sing everything in Russian, and there is beauty to that. So I wouldn't want to lose that. But if we want this to continue, we need to change it. We need to change to English. My dad, who recently passed, is the last generation. I don't speak the language. So if Doukhoborism is about the language, then it dies with that generation. If Doukhoborism is about the belief in being a good person and the belief in peace, it continues regardless of the language.
From one far horizon to another, let our universal slogan be.
Well, at home, I mean, we all said prayers at home before every meal. We went to Sobrania, Maleñez, and Blaine Lake, and it just was part of me. But at home, you just knew you were a Doukhobor, especially with grandfather. Like he was there at the burning of the arms site, and it was just such an honor to him here talk about these things, the peace in his heart, and so I just thought we needed to spread the peace as well.
It was just osmosis. I lived with my grandparents a lot because my mom was busy getting herself educated, moving around to various small towns until she worked her way to the big city of Saskatoon when I was 8 years old. So that period between when I was 2 and 8, I spent a lot of time in Blaine Lake living with my grandparents. My Babalapshinif never learned to speak English, so everything with her was in Russian. I just learned a lot being beside her. You know, watched her make all the Doukhobor traditional foods and talk about things going on.
You know, it was through those intergenerational contacts of many generations living in the same household that many Doukhobor traditions, customs, and beliefs were passed down from one generation to another. And so I feel very fortunate to have been able to have been a part of that process, that generations old process.
Baba was always a big influence on me, you know. I mean, when I was growing up, I used to come spend summers up in Blaine Lake, here in this house. And when I was here, you know, Baba would often bring me to the prayer home. She always made a point of exposing me to what was happening in the Doukhobor community. And so for me, that became part of who I was. It became part of my story. You know, going to the Blaine Lake Prayer Home as a little kid. And it was at that time primarily in Russian. I didn't always understand all of it, but it had an impact on me. And from that early age, I felt that I was part and connected to this community in some way.
I still want to pass on and feel I'm the purveyor of those traditions, whether it's a family tradition, the farm tradition, which I have a great deal of respect for and I value highly, or the Doukhobor philosophy. And that's something that I do want, I think is so important, whether my grandchildren ever attend a Sobrania or a Malenya, or there isn't even any of those events to take part in, doesn't really matter, as long as I feel that I do what my grandparents did for me, and that was to encourage the philosophy by doing. There wasn't a lot said, but it was by doing, by caring for each other, by the hospitality, by the sharing, the cooperation, the philosophy of nonviolence, of peace. Those were sort of never really spoken about. They were just done.
My dad, it's one of his favorite subjects to talk about. His eyes just light up. And I think it's really interesting too. So I try to talk about it with him and learn as much as I can.
He taught us that being a Doukhobor means that you don't fight and that you always believe in God and that God is in every one of us.
We try to take frequent trips back to places like Kenora or on special occasions to a prayer service in Saskatoon, just so my children can see Doukhoborism at a group level, and it's not just their dad going on about it. I think that's important. I have also fostered a love on their part of Doukhobor history and stories, and it's many a night, virtually every night, when before I tuck them into bed, that they ask me to tell them a Doukhobor story, and it's been great as a parent to be able to relate major historical events, whether it's the burning of arms in 1895 or the exile to the Caucasus in the 1840s or the arrival in Milky Waters in the early 1800s, as relatable events that, mean something to them as well.
There's a song called Toil and Peaceful Life. it's an English song that was written about Doukhobors, and I sing it to my kids every night. And that's part of our lullaby, part of our history, our value building.
We were punished for what we believe. Toil and peaceful life. Toil and peaceful life. With God.
And so we want our kids to understand why the Doukhobors are here, where they came from, the values they stood for, and how they can maintain those values and carry them with them and pass them on to their kids. And if we accomplish that, if we allow our kids to carry those values forward, then the Doukhobor movement hasn't changed. It's adapted, but it's lived on.
And I think the importance of that is that those generations that have gone have instilled the beliefs in us so we can continue to pass that on. And hopefully they'll pass it on to their children, but maybe in a different way. The way that I learned was still very, very traditional and very based on those who went before us and those who made the sacrifices in Russia. And not that that's not important, but maybe to continue this, maybe we need to do it in a different way. I don't know how, but maybe the younger generations living in a different century will become Doukhobors in a different way.
Мы окончили собрание и домой пойдем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Мирно тихо, мирно тихо.
Favorite song, Mi Quenchum the Sabrania, literally means, we're going to go home. We've done our service, and we're going to go home and take those lessons we learned at the service and use them in our daily lives. So later on in my life, it became more spiritual. My home is going back to where I came from spiritually. And so that where I'm here on this earth, I have lessons to learn as a spirit. And I'm going home to my Heavenly Father. So it's evolved into something different than the literal translation of the words.
My ancestors burnt their guns in 1895 because they felt if we continued on this road, civilization would be doomed. And people are talking about the same thing today. This is why the Doukhobor idea is very relevant today. And when we say, well, the community is dying out or something, it's not. The community may be dying out in the sense of a community center or a dome, but the idea is as relevant today as it was then in 1895.
In 1899, the government officials who were supporting the Doukhobor immigration, they expected that within a few generations, Doukhobors would seamlessly be integrated with other Canadians. I think if those immigration officials were to see that there continues to be a distinctive Doukhobor community today, I think they would be quite surprised by that.
That's the real challenge. We don't have, corrupt priests that we're railing against. We don't have the Tsar's horsemen that are, persecuting us and whipping us. We're not, fortunately, living in an era of constant war where, conscription of our young people is a day-to-day reality. And we've lived in a time of, we've never had greater prosperity, greater freedom, greater mobility, greater means of communicating, and yet we're faced with
arguably the greatest challenge in our group's history in terms of maintaining some sense of cohesion.
I think there will be change. There's change now, big change. And it may not be per se the way we do the service today, which is very good in my eyes, you know, in my opinion. And we are open to the public. And we have to keep our doors open for everything.
I'm hoping that God will give me the answer to what we need to do, because we just need to evolve some more. I think we need to keep those beautiful things that we have, like the singing and our food. We have to shift in our spiritual walk and talk and get more people involved. Honest to goodness, the world is looking for something better. The world is looking for something that's authentic, that they can hold on to, that they can live. I mean, Doukhobor way of life, you can live it every day.
Somehow we got to make the young people aware of this, but we have to do it in a lighter way or in a new way so that the young people can appreciate it, understand that, hey, this is where we came from, this is what happened, now we are in a new world, let's accept it the way it is and work our way into it so that we do not lose everything that we came from.
Remember your history, where you came from, what happened to them, and why we came here. But move forward, because you can't, no point living in the past. Move forward and enjoy it.
We need to be part of the contemporary society and move into the future instead of just dwelling on the past, because hope, peace, faith, love can work in the future.
I think there is a whole lot of value in continuing the future of Doukhoborism. It's really important keeping the tenets of like peace and love and respecting the fellow man, woman, and child. I would really like to see that all of the cultures and the singing and like the bread baking and the recipes and all of that like special Doukhobor history is preserved and maintained. And even if the groups are a little bit smaller, I'd still like to see it carried on. I know like it's really difficult in this day and age because everybody's all spread out across Canada and everywhere else across the world. But like the respect and the peace and the love, that's so important, and it's so necessary even still, and it needs to be spread around a little bit more.
But hope springs eternal, and I think it will, you know, if it's meant to be and that you're doing God's work, that it will carry on.
Yeah. As long as we can live in peace and harmony, I think that's all that matters.
Well, I think it's really inspiring me to be a better person because they suffered for the things they believe in. And not many people would have done that then, and I don't know anybody who would do that nowadays.
I want to try to always be a Doukhobor because it's just a good feeling that my ancestors are always watching over me.
When I'm older and have kids, I'd like to be able to tell them stories about our background and our culture, because I think it's important for people to know like where they come from and about their ancestors.
We, as Doukhobors, as much or as few as there is left, there is still that, I guess there's still that flame. Maybe not as strong as it was, but it's not out. And I think that's what's important.
May you go safely and take with you our helping hand, our love, devotion, and our friendship. учили собрания и домой пойдем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Мирно тихо, мы домой пойдем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Дай, Спаситель, нам желания, чтоб собрание посещать и учения, высшие знания Тебе возвышать. И учения, высшие знания Тебе возвышать. Мирно тихо, мы домой пойдем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Будем ждать мы до собрания, чтоб опять прийти, чтоб услышать наставления, как себе вести, чтоб услышать наставления, как себе вести. Мирно тихо, мы домой пойдем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. Все благие наставления сердцу мы возьмем. We've concluded our assembly and we'll all go home. The good teachings we have heard here we shall carry home. The good teachings we have heard here we shall carry home. Calm and peaceful, we will all go home. The good teachings we have heard here we shall take to heart. The good teachings we have heard here we shall take